Okay, fascinating tech story, one that cuts to the very heart of the moment we are in. Rite Aid. If you walked into a Rite Aid between 2012 and 2020, in one of several major urban areas, you were picked up by a facial recognition system without knowing it. And that facial recognition system was intended to head off shoplifting. These were cities in which Rite Aid had decided that there was a big problem with shoplifting, and they wanted to get out in front of it in some way. And this tech was supposed to be a way of assembling a sort of a broad database that stores could share to spot people who came back as part of organized retail crime, right? The shoplifting rings, because there are these rings of repeat offenders, basically. And they were trying to figure out how to solve that problem. Retailers all across the country trying to figure out how to solve that problem. Now, like so much in tech, so the FTC has now told Rite Aid, you're banned from using that for 5 years. And they have to submit to a kind of ongoing monitoring. There's all kinds of stuff that is a really interesting precedent for not just facial recognition, but all kinds of companies. And I've been talking to people inside the industry who were close to this Rite Aid project and people close to the FTC about what this all means, and here's what I'm learning. So the industry people are basically telling me that, like so much of tech, this began as a kind of high-minded concept that you could ethically but very smoothly create a kind of deterrent and surveillance system that would really, do what everybody wanted without persecuting anybody, right? And the notion was that you would spot people who come back repeatedly and not drag them out of line or embarrass them, but just very, in a very high touch way, just walk up to them and basically say, may I help you? How may I help you? And supposedly 9 times out of 10, when you do that to a repeat offender shoplifter, they just leave, and that would solve the problem, right? But I want to show you a chart that I think is really interesting. This chart shows the productivity compensation gap in the retail trade sector between 1987 and 2018. And what you're looking at there basically is the dotted line is the rise in the number of responsibilities a retail clerk has over time. And the purple line is the adjusted for inflation hourly compensation. So basically, money has stayed the same for people working in retail, while their job responsibilities have gone up and up and up and up. And so as a result, into that world, they deployed this surveillance system in which you didn't have people trained or with the time or resources to do that kind of "may I help you, sir" kind of thing. And instead, you had people kind of ad hoc throwing random camera phone photos into the system and feeding news clippings into this database, to the point where there were a bunch of false positives. Those false positives tended to target people with Black and Asian backgrounds, because those tend to be the places where facial recognition gets it wrong. And these sort of overzealous security guards would grab people, humiliate them in front of their colleagues and so forth. It was just a disaster. And what those people close to the project basically say is that the high-minded ideas that they had sort of all fell apart as the realism, the reality on the ground of resources and training and so forth just couldn't match their ambitions. And in fact, other companies have been pulling out of facial recognition because they're worried about being painted with the brush of looking as if they are intentionally discriminating against certain races, right? And so they would rather take the shoplifting hit, according to the people I'm speaking to, than have that perception, because it can just destroy the value of a company when you're perceived that way. And we'll see what happens with Rite Aid, right? Now, the Rite Aid says that they fundamentally disagree with many of the assessments of the FTC and but they've agreed to this, basically, to this order, and it's more or less a done deal. They're going through bankruptcy, and so the bankruptcy court has to approve it, but otherwise it's pretty much a done deal. So that's interesting. What the FTC, though, says is that this is also really a line in the sand, not just for facial recognition, but for all kinds of technology. And that what they're trying to basically establish is a way of saying to companies like Rite Aid and the companies that provide solutions to them, you cannot just experiment on people in the wild. You got to figure out ahead of time, both in the lab and in real world testing, if this works. And on an ongoing basis, you have to be on top of, you have to show us that you are monitoring in real time whether this thing works. And if you screw up, if you make a mistake, you also have to delete the data, because that's one of the things that Rite Aid is being required to do, is that database is being wiped. So You can't just like, have a data-fueled product, an AI product or a facial recognition product, whatever it is, and have it go terribly wrong, and then, you go, oh, whoops, but we're going to go back to the data and figure out other ways to use it. No, if you screw up, you lose the data, which I think is very, very interesting. So some really very high new stakes being established here, new standards being established here by this case. And I really am curious to see the degree to which it spreads across tech and becomes a precedent across tech, and not just a question of how facial recognition specifically was deployed in theory to deter shoplifters.